on this computer. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Archeology. Due to unfortunate technical difficulties, what was originally supposed to be a YouTube live has now turned into an impromptu recorded discussion between myself, Dr. Howard Williams of University of Sheffield. I apologize, Sheffild.
No, Chester. Chester, you were right
Sir.
first time.
Oh, I was right first? Okay, I apologize again.
That's all right. I'll let you off this time.
And Ian Reed. And the subject for today is something that has actually been in a lot of discussion on social media between archaeologists on TikTok, and ironically, in one of the discords that I'm a member of, which is the idea of mortuary archaeology and whether or not how ethical it is to show human remains, when can it be ethical, what is mortuary archaeology overall, and things like that. With Dr. Howard Williams here being an expert in the field of mortuary archaeology himself, though Ian and I have also have some degree of knowledge in it, as we are archaeologists in ourselves as well, with very wildly different fields and wildly different regions. Which also brings me to a preface. We're mainly going to be talking about European archaeology in this because, as an American archaeologist who works mainly in the American Southwest, the subject has already been discussed and had laws put in place to deal with it, i.e., human remains of Native American burials and things like that cannot be excavated without tribal officials present. They cannot be put in museums. Same with the burial goods and things like that. But in other countries, that is different, like in Europe, which leads me to Dr. Howard Williams. So why don't you explain to us what mortuary archaeology is, sort of in a European context?
Well, I mean, I suppose the mortuary archaeology on a global scale and on a European scale is identical in terms of its broad aspirations to be a subfield of archaeology that focuses on not only the investigation of particular types of unique kinds of archaeological context. We don't define it necessarily by grave excavation or mortuary investigation per se, but it's about the broader questions of how can we as archaeologists, using material traces, which can be graves, can be all manner of other things, reveal and reconstruct the story of human relationships with their own mortality, which includes a death, burial, commemoration, and a subsection of that is, of course, human remains. So I think one of the most common misconceptions that I see repeated and often lazily by archaeologists themselves is that mortuary archaeology is about digging up the dead. It's nothing of the kind. Mortuary archaeology is about how we study the human relationship with their own mortality, the relationship between the living, the dead, ancestors, heroes, legends, myths and stories, the past in the past, and human and understandings of time. All those broader sets of themes are as much about mortuary archaeology as simply digging up the dead. And I think often archaeologists concede that popular misconception and then try and argue a case for or against ethics based on that narrow set. And I think, so I would say that, but from a European perspective, to actually answer your question rather than just waffle off.
Oh no,
I think more European. Europe is a broader church. There's various different regional and sub-regional, national and local traditions of funerary archaeology that go back to the 18th, 19th century origins of the discipline, and early 20th century. And I would say that it has always interacted with the complex mix of different faiths in Europe. Muslim, Jewish, Catholic, Orthodox Christian, Protestant, which have very different attitudes to the dead and attitudes towards disturbing the dead. And you see that, I would say, from the very origins of the first archaeological societies in Britain, you see clergy absolutely piling in huge numbers into the it's often forgotten in the story of the great men, but actually it's local clergy and their wives and their families who are often some of the biggest constituent of members of these archaeological societies, and therefore attitudes to how we treat the dead are not new. Those debates are at the root of the discipline. I mean, as long as there were people calling archaeologists ghouls before they were even archaeologists. Antiquarians were mocked for their fixation in embalmed mummies and relics of former times, and it is almost a part of the derision of archaeology from its inception. We are a subject that's almost uncannily or ghoulishly interested in corpses, skeletons, memorials, and from those origins, we've seen obviously very localized traditions develop, very different experiences of the relationship with the church and the state and faith, and also different relationships with pagan groups as well. And you see that in different parts of Europe. And this then feeds on to different strategies and relationships with display in museums. Those countries that have a much more prolific legacy of rifling colonial graves contexts, including Britain, have actually developed more discussions of it than, say, certain countries where there's perhaps a more isolated or undeveloped discussion of the ethics of these practices, including I don't want to name and shame individual European nations, but I've had conversations with some archaeologists in other countries where, yeah, it's a thing for the States where they talk about Nagpra. We don't bother about that. It's cool. Kids love it. Put the skeletons in the museum. You have massive stores full of human remains. What's not to like? And Britain is much more in the middle between those two extremes.
Yeah.
But my point is, I suppose what I wanted to open up by trying to explain is that there is no European tradition.
Okay.
There's a real complex set of different nested relationships to funerary archaeology, and the conversations. And I've talked to some European archaeologists, and it's just like there's no conversation here. Thank you. Let's move on. That's an interesting point. How American of you, or how British of you, to even bother to mention that, whereas others go, yeah, no, we've changed the way we displayed these, that we've repatriated these collections we had that should never have been here. It depends on who you talk to and where, and so you see a spectrum of views.
Yes, yes, and that is
a fair thing.
Yeah, and that is often the case, and unfortunately, even in the U.S. with these laws, my mentor is trying to work to get certain things back from certain museums that even when the laws were passed were never returned. And I'm not going to go much into that because I don't know much about like what he's having to do because he's always busy with it. But I do know that that's still a thing. After all, like recently, I think last year or the year before, the Smithsonian finally returned these burial masks to the tribes in the Pacific Northwest over around Oregon and California and such, and the tribes proceeded to destroy them because the idea was they were supposed to be decay with the bodies and they were never supposed to be displayed, which was one of my big cruxes. Is like it depends on the country of origin, because some countries like say China and Mongolia and Japan and things like that are perfectly fine with displaying their ancestral remains. Egypt is another good example of that. Even after trying to get Britain to return many of their mummies, Egypt is still, displaying the mummies in their museums. They just want to have control over it. So I think that's one of the big nuances. Is like it depends on if the country of origin is okay with their ancestral remains being displayed, and if they have a say in that. Is sort of where I come on it. So the Native Americans generally don't want that, so we need to respect their wishes. But other countries, it goes as needed. So
I mean, I suppose you've got one of the clear examples. When I did a edited collection to address this very issue in 2016 with Mel Giles, and it's called Archaeologists and the Dead, and it's overtly, it confused a lot of North American archaeologists, which is the biggest market for these books, because we overtly ignored North America. We didn't ignore North America at all. There's multiple chapters that we have that include case studies from North America, but we overtly try to put the North American situation in a global and a European perspective. So yes, we have a chapter on the American Southwest. We have another chapter on comparing America with Scandinavia, but we try to look at British and European case studies. And it's really funny because Britain has the same problem as America. As we love to think we're the center of the archaeological universe, and a lot of the literature on these topics tries to debunk that. and like Estella Weiss-Cracy is a big name in Austrian archaeology, and she's worked in Iberia and she's worked in Central America as well. Her chapter is basically talking about how Austria is at one level just far behind in this conversation. Another level, because they've had a Reformation and a Counter-Reformation in which the display of the dead is such an integral part of Austrian sort of religious life, not in the 20th century, but in the historic churches, and there is that relationship with the dead is incredibly different from what you would expect. And there's no, and this is where I think even the very basic level of not understanding that Europe has nationalism, we have overt politics associated with the history of archaeology, but we don't have indigenous people in the same fashion. And this is something that, it's amazing how that simple point gets lost. So I've had from North American professors who had went to ethics committees at North American universities. So why didn't you get permission from the local indigenous tribe to do your work? And she said, well, working in Baden-Württemberg on Iron Age graves, or in southwest Germany. What the fuck? What are you talking about? Why would I need to start with an indigenous North American group to do that? Or why would the criteria in ethics that are framed around, rightly so, framed around the American plains or whatever, exactly. The American Florida or whatever, why would that work in a context of working in the Czech Republic or working in Serbia? I mean, that's just deeply weird and odd. And I think we're all working with our various conceits within archaeology, and the British have the same problem. I'm not trying to blame the Americans for this.
No, of course.
Oh no, in my experience, it's all to do with the whole colonialist mindset. I mean, because America is a colonial nation, and Britain colonized a bunch of places.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And we both treat the Mediterranean like it's ours archaeologically still, and we still send missions out, and we still have this terminology and language. And I'm not trying to, but I'm saying that plays out into mortuary archaeology too. Is that in our decolonization, we can actually be quite colonial in our
exactly.
It plays the same way, so we have to so that understanding local picture is really important. That's all I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to
and that's and you don't have to apologize. That's why I invited you here, because this is your cup of tea. This is your
But it was an interesting book to do because it did. One of the points is that I think the American market just couldn't quite get it, and even the big name sort of anthropologists over there went, "Oh, this is interesting to have some quirky local European context, sort of like a sort of folk, like an amusing folk tradition, like there's a lovely little tune there, or but let's get back to the real things, which is producing massive edited collections all about case studies from North America, of which you can buy about 20 now, or 30 now over the last 30 years of how many years it's NAGPA. You know what I mean? Over the last few decades, there's so many collections with bioarchaeologists, genuinely trying to grapple this issue, case studies of working with indigenous groups. It's all great, but I'm afraid that model of working with indigenous groups doesn't play out, let alone the same way in different parts of US, let alone in other parts of the world. So it's about understanding the local situation, and we can easily find ourselves doing more harm than good by thinking we're consulting with we're consulting with the local community. Well, which of the 5 churches in the village did you talk to, or which I think that's the point, isn't it? Is you can easily end up in sort of a local war between different cultural and religious groups because you thought you were dealing with the right group, and actually that was just one weirdo that no one else talks to in the region or something. So it's a minefield, to use the cliche. It's a minefield.
Well, and I know one thing that stuck with me when I was studying in my master's in the UK was because I specialize in the Iron Age, so it's like we're talking about I remember this was in one of the lectures I sat in on. This was about pagans at sites like Stonehenge, and requesting the repatriation of Neolithic European remains.
Yes.
And it's like I don't know, how political should I get with this? But anyway,
it's interesting though, isn't it?
Having these people thousands of years later practicing these reconstructed religions, and saying that we shouldn't be displaying these remains, we should be reburying them. And usually, reburying them. I mean, there's even a lot of politics with that. Is like, is that how they would want their remains taken care of, or are we ascribing our own values within this reworked religious framework?
Yeah, exactly. And there's also, not necessarily mortuary related, but there is that issue of neo-pagans, and I say this is somebody who practices a modern pagan religion. They tend to like to think that these sites are theirs, and so they tend to like to go and leave like things randomly at places and then sort of leave the area a mess, or they stampede Stonehenge like earlier, like last year during Christmas or whatever, and then while singing songs that are not, European pagan, they're often like uh appropriated Native American songs or something,
Wow.
and beating Native American drums and things like that. So
yeah, I mean, that's something too, especially with Iron
yeah,
Age. Like thinking back to the Iron Age tribes, I see a lot
yeah,
of that ethnographic comparisons with Iron Age people, whether it be
mm,
cult practices, mortuary rites, things like that, with plains, like North American plains tribes.
mm,
And I mean, I don't see it much in the modern literature, but between like, turn of the century to about the 80s, I've seen a lot of papers that did that.
uh yeah,
It's and comparisons, they're usually very loose and just kind of like talking about tribal organization, just
yeah,
kind of blind to the fact that there are a lot of very distinct cultural differences
yeah. Well,
that
no,
we can,
like very
yeah.
distinct cultural differences even in North America. Like nobody would
Oh
claim
yeah.
that the Navajo have the same cultural practices as, like, say, the Cherokee or the Haida or any, and so that's another
Yeah, I mean,
thing
yeah,
with
in
that. Yeah.
in a book I read, I saw a comparison that directly kind of lumped together the Algonquin and the Apache in like the same paragraph, and it was like,
Yeah.
Two completely different political. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
And I think
yeah.
that's the
That's a
problem with. Sorry, go on.
no. You go ahead, Howard. Yeah.
Sure. I was just going to say, well, this is the blessing and the danger, because by globalizing the Australian, New Zealand, and the North American colonial experiences with funerary remains, you are simultaneously, rightly, offering opportunities for community engagement, stakeholder co-creation of dialogues towards repatriation, of rethinking what our task is, of rethinking what our authority is, rethinking what our stories are about, and all of that, I think, is absolutely essential work. But simultaneously, we've got to keep with a second perspective. We have to be aware that if you globalize a lot of these ethnically framed ancestry focused discourses that are, and I don't take nothing away from them, but are overtly political and should be within say, a North American context, you are potentially doing some wonderful, easy work for the extreme far right in Europe, and not simply nationalist in the sense of local devolutionary voices, but we're talking about anti-immigration, xenophobic, overtly white supremacist discourse. And that's the problem with Celtic spiritualism and with Germanic spiritualism, heathenry, including Norse heathenry as an offshoot. And we can talk about that as a separate thing. But this does come back. If you're saying, it doesn't matter whether I'm biologically descendant, I sense that this is my ancestor. It's buried in the Ossibere ship burial. And I feel a special connection with the Amesbury Archer and the South Wiltshire Museum in Salisbury. I feel really, he was a European too, because he came from around Switzerland. I feel as a white man, it may be just, it may be heavily clothed, heavily concealed, but not very. The basic what you're saying, indigeneity is mobilized to be basically stoking not simply just a right-wing conservatism, of which isn't necessarily our immediate concern, but is the of the overtly far right tendencies within Europe, which has been a growing and ever emboldened phenomenon, and and so we have to be, we can't be ignoring, we can't be just using this rhetoric, and I call it rhetoric because the way it's been employed by certain British archaeologists is, oh yeah, I've read a few American archaeologists who were talking specifically about a North American context, and and then just impose it on Wiltshire, and don't think that somehow you will be not sitting in a room talking to a bunch of fascists. That's what that is. And I've been quite honest to people about my story and how my early medieval research means that I do come face to face in very benign environments with the type of people who, it's not simply they have different politics from me, but I'm not sure that I would be safe if I met them outside of that setting. And certain people of color wouldn't be safe around them outside of that setting, or women.
Of course,
And you think, actually, we've got to really it's the danger, isn't it? We can't have clean hands if we're doing this kind of research. We're dealing with stakeholder communities. You're going to get into conversations with some really obnoxious characters, and that's not the problem in itself, because if they're a tiny minority and they're talked over, then that's okay. But when you realize that your discussion, and if you're talking about indigeneity and all the stakeholder engagement, and let's hear the voice of the native Briton, well, what the heck is that saying when you see people talking about using the same discourses to bolster anti-immigration rhetorics that are actually lives are at stake here? That's the kind of thing that really worries me and that sounds like, oh well, you're talking about an academic conversation, how does this have a real impact? Well, you can do a project, let's say hypothetically, you get some funding from from government to do a local project in a local museum using the Egyptian remains, and but also using some Iron Age remains from Britain, and you say, okay, let's celebrate the bog body, we've got a local bog body, let's do a project about that. How are you going to frame that isn't going to celebrate the particularly the chauvinistic contingent within the potential audience? And I just think these are things that museums are balancing all the time. And I think a lot of British museums do go, oh, you haven't even started thinking about repatriation, you haven't even started thinking about it. I think they do, but they're always worried about the massive complex political fallout if they cross certain lines. So I think it's really difficult. It all comes down to money, funding, and trying to balance doing some good with the potential unleashing of hate that you can get even around something as ancient as an Iron Age bog body. It can suddenly kick off. And
actually, funnily enough, you mentioned that the like essentially quest for the creation of quote unquote indigeneity by white Europeans, that's very much happening in the US too. I can say that for a fact. A lot of it's somebody who does practice modern Germanic heathenry. I see it firsthand. Oh boy, so many people want that in indigeneity. I mean, and there are a whole bunch of groups in the US that I'm sure you're aware of, like the AFA and McNowan and things like that, Edward Thorson, Stephen McNowan. So yeah, they are very much doing that, and that's what part of the problem is. Like, you find these Iron Age Viking burials, and suddenly they turn them into this whole political, look at this, whereas
sorry,
I was gonna say, like, well, for example, there was a documentary a few years ago that I'm sure Howard probably remembers, where it was about the Vikings TV show, and they talk about supposedly in it finding the quote unquote burial of Ivar the Boneless, supposedly, and they're like, their only evidence in that documentary is that he had a drinking horn or something in his the area where his genitals would be, and they're like, so this means that perhaps he was castrated. And I was like, even then I was watching that, I was like, well, that's funny, and that would be funny if it's true, but also, like, how do you tell that? Like, a random drinking horn lying in that area doesn't equate somebody was mutilated after death. It could just have been put there, So
well, and anyway, just something quick in terms of indigeneity, and I'm sure this would be of interest to you, Dane. I know a couple decades ago there was a huge clamor in New England about something called Thorvald's Rock, which is from coastal New Hampshire. I mean, I'm from further inland New Hampshire, but same state. But yeah, it's like based on a misreading of the Vinland sagas, which was actually pretty popular for a while. Yeah, no, I got it in a rack from an old class in my bachelor's. But anyway, yeah, it had, well, supposedly an inscription that said Thorvald on this rather large coastal boulder, and then it was kind of gated off by a local museum. However, the reason it was gated off is because people started taking chips out of it because they thought it was, Eric's brother, like his inscription that they had made it down to New Hampshire, and before anyone can study it, like half of the rock was like chipped off and taken away by thousands of different people.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was just
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So Howard, you were about to say something before.
Oh, I think that it's just I suppose from my talking to individual museum curators, who shall remain nameless, I think that some projects, there are repatriation processes ongoing from the UK. I see a lot of discussion on, as if we're not doing anything, that there's all the archaeologists are resistant to this. And I think there's a lot of, when the colonial collections, the British Museum is legislated against, deaccessioning any of its objects, that we need an act of parliament to allow the return of various objects. So I think that is exceptionally, that's odd. That is not typical of British museums. A lot of other British museums are heavily strapped for funding, but within the context in which they work, they are, actively, the museum archaeology community has long been supportive of those processes. My what I'm talking about here is more, what do we do with our own, national collections and local collections, and that's much more. Even that is what I'm trying to impress upon people again and again, is it's not just a controversial ethical issue when it involves repatriation, right? There's so many other issues about how, where, why we store, display, how we write about, talk about these remains that are ethically charged and politically, potentially powerful. I've just done a research paper in a book that I edited on the public archaeology treasure, where I talk about the mound one, the famous mound one Sutton Hoo burial, which is of course by definition a burial without any surviving demonstrable human remains.
Yeah.
Although there may be up to one or two bodies associated with that mound, depending on who you talk to and how you interpret that burial assemblage. It is the acidic soils leached it away. So and yet the language in which that assemblage has been talked about has been heavily politically and culturally charged since 1939, when it was discovered. Even when it was framed during the war, the Nazi regime got hold of it and saw it as a lovely example of the spread of Germanic culture, and and that this is, wouldn't it be good if the Brits were just under the benevolent thumb of the Wehrmacht, and it was used in that way. But also Swedish archaeologists were played into that Nazi discourse as well, including Sune Lindqvist. But subsequently it became a national treasure, literally, without Nicolas Cage. But it came this idea of a treasure that embodies early England, and so I chart the story of how the word treasure is used to refer to the assemblage. And so that's nothing to do with human remains, but it's a good example for listeners of how we don't need bodies for it to be politicized, ethically charged, and controversial. Even assemblages which lack the human remains surviving can be mobilized into all manner of stories about peoples, their origins, and ideas of nationhood.
Yeah, and that's funny enough, because you mentioned that, because there's an example of things that lack a body that can be politicized, burials that lack a body. A few years ago, because and I'm bringing this up because where I'm going into for my master's and doctoral stuff, is I plan on going into Mongolian archaeology and East Asian archaeology.
Well,
and things like that. But so I always pay attention to archaeological finds from there. But a few years back, I don't remember exactly. I'm sure I could look it up and find the exact date. But Chinese archaeologists supposedly found the quote unquote burial of the Chinese warlord from the 200s CE, Cao Cao. And they started, like letting Chinese citizens go, and they turned it into a sort of museum and such. But other Chinese archaeologists were like, "Hey, one, this doesn't have any bodies," and they're like, "Two, the records say that Cao Cao built like 200 fake tombs also to like throw off anybody, so they couldn't find his body." So they're like,
wow, I didn't
so
know
they're
about
like,
this.
yeah, so they're like, why didn't we? So some of the Chinese archaeologists are like, so why are we assuming that this is actually his tomb? It could just as easily be one of the like hundreds of other tombs that he built to as decoys. But of course, because it's connected to this great individual from Chinese history, it started to become this whole politicized thing, whether or not it was actually his burial, you know. So
Regardless, it still ends up being a cenotaph, regardless of his original intentions.
yeah, it's still a drawing. If it, because I tend to agree, considering that no body was found, I'm like, okay, which doesn't necessarily mean anything, but considering the context of he built a whole bunch of decoy tombs and you don't find any burial goods or any body in this tomb, I'm like, this is probably one of the decoys, but that means it's doing its job. So, so yeah. So, but yeah, so it's along that same lines. It just doesn't matter. It doesn't always matter if a body is found. It'll still be politicized one way or another, which again also brings it back to the country of origin. It's up to the country of origin to decide whether or not they want to display the burial goods and tombs and such of their ancestral heritage, which is, of course, goes back to Howard Williams' whole thing is we as Americans tend to try to impose our laws, NAGPRA and things like that onto other countries when it's like, well, again, it's more nuanced than that. If the country of origin is having a say in what it wants, how it wants its cultural heritage displayed, that's fine. It's like it's if they want to or not. It only changes if say we as Americans or Britons or whoever go to somewhere like Native American tribes or to people in Central Asia or Aboriginal Australians and whatever and tell them nope, regardless of what you say, we're going to display it against your wishes. That's where it becomes an issue in my opinion. But other than that, if they have a say in it, I think that's fine.
You've got to remember that a lot of the resentments towards what is held in national museums are not simply external, they're internal. So, for example, in my region, one of those famous funerary finds ever from Northeast Wales is the Mould Cape, the gold cape that sits in the British Museum and has been sent on tour a couple of times. But I really caused problem. I didn't realize this is where, again, I often criticize others for not noticing when they get into hot water, but I without thinking, put on my blog, I went to the Wrexham Museum and I saw the Mould Cape for the first time back in Wrexham in my lifetime. Let's keep it here, folks. Why are we sending it back to the British Museum? And I couldn't believe the silences. It's like that you test on social media the noise, and then you also hear this, oh, there's a lot of silence and awkwardness going on here. And I thought that would just be I thought a lot of people in Northeast Wales, a lot of people in Wrexham and Mould, sort of two relatively. Wrexham's now a city. We've got Ryan Reynolds. We got Wrexham FC now. We got that sort of international aura going on. But no one cares about Wrexham's much derided for the last 50 years. No one's ever made a proper formal claim for an object like that to reside in a proper exhibit. But frankly, what the heck is it doing in the British Museum? That's it's same with a lot of Scottish stuff that's in Edinburgh, and a lot of local Scots go, what the heck is it? Don't send it to Edinburgh. We want that in our local museum. So there's a lot of that local pride, which can be positive and can critique those nationalist sort of stuff too. It's not, so it's so complicated, and I don't envy museum curators having to navigate these many.
I mean, because it's like, I know one thing off the top of my head, the Lewis Chessman from Scottish Isles split up between Edinburgh and the British Museum.
Yeah.
I know I remember that right off the head because I just love him. I mean, especially the little guy that looks like he's so bored of being a chess piece. But But yeah, it's
and especially when you're splitting collections and you think the Parthenon marbles and you think, you know, they are literally split, and you know you have and it's difficult to sort of convey. It's easy on social media to do a hot take and go, yeah, send them home, you know, and you go, yeah, great, I agree, and yet I don't, because, or I do, but how the heck are we going to do that? And and it's often the people think that archaeologists have more power than we do. So I think a lot of, you know, like no one listens to academics at universities really, apart from maybe one or two, you know, who get constantly quoted in the media. But most of us are, you know, no one's listening, you know. And the same with museum curators. No, you know, it's so difficult to.
Because one thing, kind of like just for a moment, cycling back to public reception of archaeology. It's just I feel that the media tends to latch on to misconceptions of what we say because they tend to be a bit more sensational. And even then, it's like between that and conspiracy theories, to the point where people have heard all of this incorrect information and tune out the corrections.
Well, it's like I had a conversation on that same subject. I had a brief, civil, but a brief conversation with somebody on Facebook 2 years ago when an article came out. Now, the of course the news article versus the academic article said two different things. And the news article was like, "Oh, archaeologists say they've realized that like something about like." Grave goods or archaeological finds that are like, say, obviously like it's a toy wooden sword for a kid or something, like, or you know they you know they're saying they've realized it's for, you know, kids or something like that, when the paper actually, you know, wasn't saying that. They were saying, they're like, hey, we need a better description for these things, rather than say, oh, kid's sword. We need to come up with an actual like categorization system so we can make it easier in records and things like that to distinguish. They're like, they were never saying like, oh, we didn't know what these were. They're like, they knew what it was the whole time. They were just like, we need a better way to categorize and record them in the record than just saying random kid's toy sword or something like that, you know. So
I think a lot of there's a whole complex discussion to be had about how we manage the media, and universities have their press releases. Academics sometimes do a lot of good work to, you know, amplify and support narratives that are in their research. And now some journals have a whole dedicated social media streams to promoting the latest articles. And some of that is quite shockingly good, and some of it is quite shockingly irresponsible in my experience of, and I'm talking about really last couple of years. It's like, and I see, you know, the blurring of the lines. When you know, one level it's canny, you have to control the narrative, you know, by making a good press release, making sure that it's not just out there with a pithy headline and then, oh, who cares what happens to it? You try and stay with the story. But other times I've seen it's just like, yeah, you did well. You got 58,000 whatever's on this views on this, and you did a piece in The Conversation, but really, wouldn't it have been easier just if you'd shut the F up, you know, because frankly the story is so garbage now, not the actual research, you know, but the way it's now in the media is such trash, you know. Wouldn't it have been better if you just shut up know, and let the media do their own thing, where there would have been some journalistic correction? Not all journalists are bad. A lot of journalists take a headline, but you know, the meat's in the story. They get a catchy headline and everyone rolls their eyes, you know, ancient Britons were this, or the Vikings did that, and you actually look at the research and you learn something. So why are we fixated on the headline when even the lead, let alone the detail, are there? So I'm quite forgiving. I think while we bash journalists a lot, I think there's a lot of problems with how we set up our arguments, set up our narratives. We can't blame everyone else for not understanding how great we are if we are still doing this.
Exactly.
Do you know what I mean? I'm not saying we're always to blame ourselves. I think just there's a bigger challenge that just bashing journalists and saying, the journalists are always going to get it wrong. They don't or the public don't understand. You know, if you said something that you could have predicted is going to lead to a really sensationalist topic, maybe in the key, you know, bullet points of your conclusion, point out here are some qualifiers. Here's an alternative view.
Yeah.
What's stopping you thinking about that? No, we're responsible for a lot of the shit that happens, is my point.
And I agree 100%. And that's what I, even like in my YouTube videos, I try to be like, now this doesn't mean that this is necessarily how it goes. This is just the general consensus, and I try to have a lot of qualifiers. And of course, people still take that out of hand, and but that's going to happen anyway. I've had some weird comments and some weird conspiracy theory comments that just didn't make sense. Like, for example, somebody trying to claim that Zheng He, the Ming admiral who like sort of explored did tribute missions around like Africa and things like that, and sort of set up the infrastructure that allowed Magellan to come through there. They tried to claim that he was somebody made up by Chinese historians and archaeologists, when it's just like, no, we have the records, and of course he never provided any sources, because of course they never did. So but yeah, and it's important to remember not all journalists are, for example, Graham Hancock, because while Graham Hancock is an idiot, and he can go ahead and get mad at me and claim that I'm oppressing him or repressing him or whatever it is. If he was more honest, I would be more sympathetic. But again, not all journalists are like him.
No, I mean he's a failed journalist.
Yeah, he
has even a sub university level of understanding archaeological data.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean he's not typical of anything, and we shouldn't give him, one level we need to just like ignore him, but another level we have to have a firm stance of what we think about his ideas, which is constant, isn't it, all the time. What do you think of Graham Hancock's bullshit? Nothing is bullshit. Oh, you just don't like him. Yeah, I just don't like him. So what? Move on.
Yeah, let's move on. Yeah, exactly.
And then it's like you sit far enough behind the scenes, because like with Graham Hancock, it's like you learn, like, for example, in the third, I think it was the third episode. I only watched a few because I got frustrated after a while. But
I hate watched it.
And it was the one talking about Malta, whichever episode that was.
Oh yeah.
And they were interviewing the archaeologist afterwards, and they were like, oh yeah, they just fished sound bites out of me, and I didn't actually say this, this, and this.
Yeah.
And then I remember talking to actually one of my former advisors and another one of my professors from my undergrad, who far before I went there were interviewed by the History Channel for Battles BC. And their words were taken so far out of context that it made them look like they knew less than the West Point historian who didn't even specialize in the period, and they were pissed.
Yeah,
I mean, I must say that my 5 times on TV, if I come across wrong, it's my own fault. There's nothing. All 5 times I've dealt with different film crews, different programs, different genres. I've only one of those 5 was an archaeology history program. The other one was religious history. One was art history, and one was a kind of my point, I can't remember I've lost track. There's only 5 of them, and already I've forgotten them. But they're not. I mean, my point would be that may be American. That's a very American experience, and I have heard of academics who've been told they've been set up. I think I know an academic who's a rune specialist who was asked to go on the bullshit of Oak Island or something. The curse of
Curse of Oak
Island. That thing. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
And they went on.
I could only watch the first couple episodes.
And apparently, I don't know if they ever made the cut, because they said, "What is this, runes?" And she went, "No."
Yeah. Well, that's sort of like the movie.
Could it be? No.
That's sort of like Mel Gibson's movie, The Patriot, about the Revolutionary War. I watched a clip where like the guy who plays like the main villain, the main British villain of the movie, he was like, yeah, there was an actual Revolutionary War historian there, and he's like, I was excited because for Britain it's just sort of a footnote in history, sort of. And he's like, so I was asking him all questions about it, and he's like, well, was it really like, is this scene what it was really like? No. What about this scene? No. What about this scene? And he said, and eventually asked him, was like, why are you here? And the historian was like, probably so they could say that they had a Revolutionary War historian on site. Yeah.
I'm probably repeating an anecdote I shared with you, Dane, but someone who remained nameless was a stand-in historical consultant on season think season 3 or season 2 of a certain well-known Viking-related TV program.
Yeah.
And the one question they had all day was just how scared would the Saxons be at the Vikings raiding their village at this precise moment? And he said, very scared. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, what else are you supposed to say? That was it. That was his
Yeah.
contribution to the day, his
Yeah.
filming, and you see,
Yeah.
I'm not saying I would have done better. I think
No,
you've got to understand the limitations of our power to alter
exactly.
the narratives, whether it were dealing with popular culture. But mortuary archaeology comes into play here all the time, of course,
Yeah.
because you talk to some people and, they're emphatic that we've got evidence, without doubt, of various things that are based on very slender mortuary archaeological foundations. And we have to be careful about where we respond, because there's for every time we agree with something, there's a massive audience that would happily lap it up. And every time we go, well, I'm not so sure about that, that there's literally ravening wolves of various extremist or groups are just waiting for the doubt so they can go, all these, and so it's really difficult, because what you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't with this kind of broader pop culture contributions.
Exactly.
I mean, even beyond pop culture too. I remember one of the first things I read for my master's was basically a academic discussion, which was tantamount to a argument about Celticity and how far Celts existed in the past.
Oh, I love that one.
Oh yeah.
And
never gets arguments about that. Everyone always agrees. Not.
Yeah. Or
I mean, because it's like, because you have the nuance where it's like, ethnicities are always changing, and yes, individual Celtic ethnicities existed, but like there was not until recently a pan-Celticism. And so it's like, when you misstate that, like it was in some of the first few articles, people immediately jump on that, and it's like, what, you're saying the Celts never existed? And then it turns into a flame war.
Yeah. Well, which is also funny, because even like and Ian, I wouldn't be surprised if, in fact, I would assume he read this, but like even in, like, for example, Tacitus makes a point to mention that, like, the Celtic and Germanic tribes on the borders share several different customs, and he even says it's hard to tell the difference between them, which is
exactly.
I mean, because even if you look in a good example, Livy's Historia, where you're looking at there are various descriptions of the Gallic invasions of Italy where the Gauls are very similar to what we archaeologically know about the Scythians, and they basically kind of mash most of Northern Europe together into a single ethnicity.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And so, ancient historians are very guilty of this as well.
Yes. Well, and then another argument that I know I've seen Howard talk about on his TikTok is like, when did the Viking Age begin? Did it ever really begin? Because I'm a proponent of that we need to sort of do away a little bit with the idea that the Viking Age had a clear beginning, because we have evidence of Scandinavian raids far further in the past. Gregory of Tours mentions it in two of his documents, the History of the Franks and the Regium Francorum, where he mentions just briefly that Danes under the Danish king named Chilicicocus or something like that. It's like some long, illegible name, raided the coast of Frisia that was currently under rule of like Charles Martel or something like that. So we get brief, mentions of those little raids here or there, plus, the Vendel period, you could argue the Vendel period is a predecessor to the Viking Age, but some people like to divide them into clear, distinct time period. So that's another broad argument that you could have that is also connected to burial goods, because some people are like, this is a Vendel period burial, but it might have some characteristics of the Viking Age and vice versa. So
because one of my favorite terms talking about European prehistory, proto-history, and like early history, especially in Britain, Roman Iron Age. Is because, the Romans weren't everywhere, and yet we still mark certain periods of, like, for example, Scotland by Roman invasions.
Uh,
And so it's like, yeah, I mean, when you're looking at like some parts of, like, for example, Lothian, and especially like sites like Traprain Law,
yeah.
like, yeah, you do have Romans there. I mean, were they there the whole time? No,
Mm.
but they were there. And of course, you also have like Roman marching camps, like in like Aberdeenshire, like also out by, I want to say Elgin.
Yeah.
Whoever in the comments can correct me on that. But anyway,
yeah.
but yeah, I mean, because it's like you have a vast changing political and social system sweeping through, but it wasn't equal in every location.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it gets interesting trying to mark historical periods by political entities
Mm-hmm.
and material culture.
Yeah.
And this is why I think that, you know, at one level, our terminology is really, you know, it is always going to mislead, is always going to have baggage, whether it's nationalistic, racial, linguistic, and so on. And at one level, we can't do anything about that. These are the terms the public know, and we can't change. But there's lots of ways we can, even if we feel we have to still talk about the Viking Age, that we can get audiences via our social media, via museum exhibits, via our publications, to really unpack those, you know, their assumptions about what these mean. And in funerary archaeology, you know, we've had these debates long and hard. So, for example, I'm still shocked to see people in the 2020s, which is what we're in, talking about using terms like warrior grave. And it's something that I had taught out of me age 21 at undergraduate level, or age 20, you know, undergraduate level. So why that in like 1919, back in the day, we don't want to know when it was, back in the day, you know, and you sort of, and you think, well, why the hell are we still talking about warrior grave? Because there's a burial with a weapon in it. Why aren't, you know, and these terms have all manner of misleading associations. So it's not about saying, oh, it doesn't matter what we call them, the public need them. It's about how we use those terminologies to help people think through problems of interpretation, be it about why grave goods are placed with the dead, be it about why funerary monuments are selected, about where and when do megalithic architectures emerge. You know, whatever your question, using funerary data, you think, how do we make this interesting? How do we get past? Because archaeology has a unique problem that I know a lot of archaeologists aware of, that we feel we've got to dumb down all the time.
Yeah.
And sometimes we do. Other times you can see that on a channel like TikTok, there's the people who drudge around asking the same boring questions about archaeology, but there's a lot of people with thirst for knowledge. Someone like M. Pardon and her medieval stuff about law courts in the 14th, 15th century in the Netherlands or the Belgium or wherever it may be, or northern France. You know, you suddenly get you can get an introduction. You know, what did medieval people think about marriage? Okay, well, and then suddenly you can get really past that into really depth of debate. And mortuary archaeology really has that potential when we're dealing with issues, whether it's issues about how do we sex estimate skeletons, whether we're talking about repatriation. We don't have to come back to these sort of moronically simple, send everything back to where it came from, or if it's got objects we would call female, but it's the osteological sexing is estimating a male, then it must be X or Y. You know, there's a lot of, you know, ways we can get past that sort of soundbite to more enriched conversations about identity, society, economy, religion, without having to just regress all the time. And I think we often do ourselves a big disservice as archaeologists by assuming the public don't care about that detail. No, perhaps the people we constantly try to pander to don't give a flat about that detail. There's plenty of other people who nerd out about these details the same way they nerd about, I don't know anything about, you know, quasars, but there's lots of people who will nerd out on TikTok for, you know, channels dedicated to astrophysics. It's all lost on me because I'm a thicko. I don't understand any of that. But you know, there are people that will get into it. There are, in the same way, there are people obsessed about, you know, why Obi-Wan's, you know, cloak was slightly too short in episode 7 or something, or, you know. But I just made that up. I don't know if that's true. But, you know, people care about this minutiae, and we can start with the big and then drill down to that. and we will lose people on the way, sure, but the journey will be worthwhile for some. And some people, I don't see why we're so scared of that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's important. That's what I try to do on my channel, and I know you try to do on your channel. It's you try to, it's important to try to bring in people who wouldn't necessarily, who might not know about it but might find it interesting, or even to bring it to the attention of people who maybe haven't heard about these cool discoveries of archaeology before.
Yeah. And I think it's important with burial archaeology. You are dealing with, you've got a heavy ethical responsibility. You're dealing with human remains. You're dealing with a past person. And sometimes, having flipped, I totally contradict myself by saying sometimes we shouldn't be ashamed to say very bold, simple things. Sometimes, for one audience, you can say, oh, it's really complicated. The burial evidence shows us that some men had weapons and some women may have had weapons, but were they being reused as weaving batons? And and other people just need to hear, do you know what, there are plenty of evidence of female weapon burials. And sometimes people need that just to kick some prejudices into touch to break up. It's again, it's about pitching the audience, and then I've heard people say to me across videos on TikTok, look at the hypocrite woke libtard, whatever phrase, academic. Here he's happy to accept there's complications on this issue, but here he is saying, and I go, well, yes, it is hypocritical, but actually I'm trying to pitch different points on different audiences who need to hear different things depending on where the education's gone. So with a school group of 9-year-olds going around a museum, you don't want to say, I had an experience I may have not shared with you, but I went to last year to a living history heritage site, and one of my kids went up to you'll be interested in this, Ian, went up to the female reenactor and went, oh, you're like Queen Boudica, you're like a Celt. And she went, we don't call them Celts here, they're Iron Age Britons. And my 9-year-old's like, oh, okay. And I caught up and I said, the woman's a bit weird. Yes, she's a Celt, because they're taught it in the national freaking curriculum for Wales, or they were until they've changed it again. But my point is, why shout almost? Well, didn't shout, but reprimand a 9-year-old for using the word Celt, who's actually showing enthusiasm and interest for what you're doing.
Exactly.
And it's just like beggars belief the amount of own goals we create in our
and
shouting at people.
And that's funny because
I know one thing my parents do with me. It's like when I asked about the minutia, they would tell me, but it's like if it was just I was out somewhere and it was just a simple question, I was given a simple answer.
And that's what I've done, because like the past few months I've been really engaging with public archaeology, trying to get people interested, the younger generation mainly interested in archaeology. Like I contacted my son's second grade teacher, because he apparently they had their career day, where all the people came out, and he's like, Dad, why didn't you come to career day? I'm like, I didn't realize there was a career day going on. And so I contacted the second grade teacher, and it was, very amicable conversation. I was just like, hey, I'm an it's me, Wyatt's dad. I'm an archaeologist. I was wondering if you perhaps would want me to come and teach your second grade class about archaeology. And I ended up teaching the whole second grade, all the second grade classes, not just hers. And while I was there, of course, kids asked, do you dig dinosaurs? And I didn't yell at them, where I was like, no, archaeologists dig up, the remains of past humans, their pots and their things like that. Paleontologists are going to pick up dinosaurs. It's just I don't understand why people yell at kids like that, because they don't know any better. Just you take that time to engage with them. Oh, you're like Boudica, you're like a Celt. Don't yell oh yeah, well actually, and then go in and then maybe explain it a little bit. It's see, the Celts is a broad term, or maybe and that's just right off the top of my head. I don't know that I would necessarily do it that way, but just don't get mad at people if they're genuinely interested.
Maybe save the etymology to high school.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
But I would be happy to, maybe this will sound really crazy in this context, but let's take a mortuary example. if I know a group of kids or group of adults or whatever are interested in dinosaurs,
Yeah.
this is, I haven't done any research on this, but I'm just making something up, and this is not real, folks. I'm just using.
Yeah.
If you wanted to say, okay, right, some of these smaller dinosaurs were really clever, right? We
Yeah.
don't know whether they were dolphin clever or humanoid clever. They had, sophisticated communication systems involving clicks and whistles and all this stuff. All these hypotheticals, right? Let's take all that one. Let's say they buried their dead. What would dinosaurs bury their dead? How would the bearers, where would they bury the dead, and why? And then let's have a conversation about that. And it's totally evidence lacking. But if it can get a group of people thinking about, well, what animals do have, because there's whole, obviously, as you know, there's debates about when do humans start being human, and is burial of the dead, as we've seen with the debates about Homo naledi, when is burying the dead a definition of humanity's course? What does this tell us? But let's take it out there. Let's talk about Klingons. Let's talk about dinosaurs. Let's talk about anything. If we can get people thinking about the concepts, the ideas, and no, folks, I'm not advocating a mad theory that dinosaurs cremated their dead on pyres or anything. So I can imagine the artwork. We can do an AI.
Yeah.
AI, create a nice, in a woodcut style of the 17th century, brachiosauruses cremating their dead. No. But my point is, if it gets you to a really interesting conversation, even if it's humorous, even if it's ludicrous, that's what we should be doing. We shouldn't be obsessed with accuracy if the conversation is about concepts. And then, of course, you don't want to leave it there. You want to say, well, of course, we know that didn't happen, but let's talk about a scenario where we do know. And then you can take people places. And I suppose it's just about, we shouldn't be too terrified about saying outrageous and bold things if we back it up or qualify.
Yeah.
The problem comes when we say bullshit and there's just a smirk and, oh, well, the public would believe that at face value. How ironic, well, yeah, it is, but why don't you follow that up and say what we do know? That's where we get angry, when you think, shows that the draw on archaeological sources, maybe bollocks if they're the Netflix show, but you can move with it. I mean, that's why you probably don't want to go there, but that's one of the most fascinating things I did a blog post of was about the Cleopatra 4-part Netflix. It wasn't about the skin color and the actor choice, but the fact that they had her cremated at the end on a pyre on the delta of the Nile, which was just amazingly fantastical and made up. But why did they do that? And so I did a little blog post trying to reflect on why did the TV show this totally fictional scenario of Cleopatra's body being cremated on a raft out on still water? Why? And I tried to suggest why they did that. But it. Yeah, I'm not saying. I mean, it's wrong. I mean, it's not wrong because we don't know. But I mean, it's. I don't know where that came from, but I thought it was really fascinating, and let's have a conversation about it.
Because I know. Just bringing it briefly back to the scientific dimension, and at the risk of maybe mildly flustering Lewis Binford fans, it's.
Do they exist still in the States?
Mm-hmm.
Do they still exist?
I mean, yeah. I mean, because it depends on the college, but I mean, like, a lot of anthropology programs will lean more towards the post-processual side. It's a little weird here, but I know my undergrad was in classics, so a lot of mine were processual, even though I am a post-processualist mostly.
Yeah.
But, so it's like, I know that's a video in itself, but anyway, with ethnographic comparison, I know like what I was talking about it earlier, but it is useful to an extent in showing broader concepts in hypothesizing possible similarities and constructing possible frameworks.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it requires a lot of qualifications, but it's still a useful tool.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And going back to coming up with fantastical things that we don't necessarily know, like a good example of this is with going to Vikings briefly. You always see people being Vikings, and whether it be in like How to Train Your Dragon or the Vikings TV series or anything like that. It's always like, let's put them out in a boat and light it on fire, which is like, only one way of burying people during the Viking Age and the Vendel period and the Iron Age and things like that, because all of those also existed throughout all those periods, and also during the Bronze Age. And like, say, for example, Greece, sometimes people would be burned in a fire, sometimes people would be buried, but it's always funny that that's what they portray. It's like, oh, shove them off in a ship and burn it on fire, but
Yeah.
as inaccurate as that is, it still draws people's attention and it gets people interested in Vikings. And then you can be like, well, yes, sometimes they burnt their bodies, sometimes they buried them in a burial mound, sometimes they just buried them where they lie, as we found, for example, with like a lot of the burials with the Great Heathen Army, or the so-called Great Heathen Army in England, where it's just like, oh, here's just a bunch of guys who died in battle and they were shoved in a pit and then buried over, like so. So I definitely agree. Sometimes so long as you don't, but I'm always on the fence about this, because I get annoyed when people don't realize that when movies don't portray things 100% historically accurate, but at the same time, a lot of times I'm like, well, I can understand this as long as they get interested in it, and they actually go and do their due diligence and look for that. So I'm sort of on the middle of that, but I can definitely see your point there, and that's sort of how that works, especially with the Viking Age, So,
yeah, because I know my dad from a young age turned me on to stuff like Stargate, and here I am now with actual degrees in archaeology, and I'm like,
yeah, same here. Yeah,
But,
don't be embarrassed about it. Wear it with a badge of honor, because I mean, everybody I talk to and I've done interviews with says, yeah, I was really into Arthurian fantasy and I was into Dungeons and Dragons. And there's nothing shameful about this. We need fantasy. We need these alternate paths to spark our imagination. It doesn't mean that the products we create in our research are tainted. It actually shows that we've got bright, inquiring minds that are interested in worlds other than our own, that we can then apply to the actual story of humanity on Earth. I'm very unapologetically robust about that. That we even these shows that are allegedly historically informed about mortuary practices, they're not all bad. There's really constructive ways we can utilize those fictions to take us into. I mean, like, I don't know how we could teach the history of archaeology without the Indiana Jones films now. It doesn't mean that anything in the Indiana Jones film actually happened, but we can still constructively utilize that franchise to critique, debate, discuss all manner of things, from gender, colonialism, Nazi appropriations of the past, and the occult. There's lots of ways we can that there are chimes with reality. I did a whole Archeo Wolf TikTok live about that, but we could I'm not saying that we should indulge and embrace them and give our stamp of approval to them, but I think we can see many constructive ways of building our own experience and being honest about our own enthusiasms to shed light on our research. So Ian, are you still working on Iron Age stuff at the moment, or is that something?
No, there were a few. I'm not going to go into it here, but there were a few family things. I ended up moving back to the States after I was done at York. Soon, once I finish dealing with family things, I'm probably gonna get like work in, like, I don't know, CRM, depending on what's available in my area. But I do eventually want to continue with Iron Age with the PhD and everything. Looking at schools both here and back in the UK, because honestly,
exactly,
UK's system was, I liked it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Fantastic. Well, and then another thing, I want to get talking about Indiana Jones. Funnily enough, while as inaccurate as it is, there was actually a well-known archaeologist of the Bronze Age Mediterranean who did fight Nazis. A certain man by the name of John Pendlebury, who is well known for using a sword cane. And like, as soon as World War II broke out, he came to British intelligence like, "Hey, I know Crete very well. Do you want me to help set up like defensive measures in Crete?" And he actually died in battle with the Nazis. Like, he was leading guerrilla warfare groups against the Nazis as they were invading Crete and taking it over. So
they should make a movie about that. Yeah.
I know, right? Well, and then also, the Nazis did, of course, go after various archaeological sites. The Honorba are very well known for doing that. I think they looked. Funnily enough, I think they did look for the Ark, but I think that was like in Ethiopia or something like that, or Jordan. I forget.
I can't
I
recall
forget.
off the top of my head.
I forget because they never actually went to Egypt. They went to other places in Africa, and
Yeah,
I don't remember exactly which place they went to. But yeah,
I think there was also something they were doing in Jerusalem. Was that like the
yeah,
current
something like
thing?
that. Yeah. So
Yeah.
and I think they definitely did probably loot some graves. Probably, I would be very surprised if they didn't actually. Which actually brings us into another thing. A lot of times, mortuary archaeology is very useful and important in terms of saving and repairing archaeological sites and burials that have been totally fucked over by looters. I actually participated in that in Mongolia, where it was originally supposed to only be for a couple of weeks at this one area, but it turned out the destruction was so broad. We had to like, okay, no, we've got to save these things as quickly as possible, because they were these bodies and burial goods and things like that were exposed to the elements and were degrading as we spoke. So taking the time to repair and take and save these things, was of the utmost importance. And it turned out to actually be, according to the head Mongolian archaeologist at the site, he thought it was one of the areas that members of the royal family of the Mongol Empire may have been interred. Not the royal family, that we know where that mountain is. It's called the Burkhan Khaldun. No digging excavations are probably ever going to happen there, because there is a Mongolian clan, to my understanding, that has been tasked since the time of Chinggis Khan to guard that mountain, and they are very adamant that they'll let people go and like do lidar and GPR, but they're like, no, if you excavate anything, it's not going to end well for you, kind
You'll
of thing.
die.
Oh no, literally.
It is cursed.
No, we're
Sounds
talking
like the Mummy. They always say that, don't they, in the Mummy
yeah,
films?
no, we're talking like apparently now. Of course, this could be sensationalized on the documentary that I saw, but one guy told somebody, yeah, one guy told somebody there's like, if I see you excavating the thing, I'm gonna take out my knife and yeah. So yeah. So I think that's an important thing to remember, is that sometimes you can't rebury the thing. You have to take it out and save it and make sure it doesn't get destroyed by the environment.
Yes.
In fact,
Yes,
with Tutankhamun's tomb, it was a surprise that it had not been looted already.
Again, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about what archaeologists do.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're dealing with coastal erosion or riverbank erosion,
Yeah.
or you're dealing with housing developments, or you're
Yep.
dealing with a new road construction or a quarry, a lot of archaeology has been suffered and destroyed because people were so passionate about jobs in their area that they didn't give a flying fart about the archaeology. So it's a bit rich when archaeologists are only derided by people saying, "Oh, all you do is just dig up graves. All you just care about is," we're saving these remains from oblivion, and there is a responsibility and respect in archaeology. So archaeology finds itself in different relationships with the public and different relationships with development. Sometimes we are with the developers, we're seen as part of the problem of the oil pipeline or the whatever it may be. And other times we can be a really powerful source of cultural resistance to development and destruction of natural and cultural resources. So it's never quite so easy, and graves can be a very powerful way to mobilize resistance to international companies or national authorities or their various packagings of those power bases to allow indigenous and local people to explain the importance of their landscape. And there's many cases where archaeologists find themselves on that side as well as the side of the big powerful developers and so on.
Yeah, and in fact, now of course I can't disclose where the location of this is, but one of my supervisors talked about how like a few years back this cul-de-sac neighborhood was being built on an area that was known to have, or at least suspected to have burials of Cherokee burials from like the 17 through 1800s and such, which of course NAGPRA means that you got to go and so a lot of times the tribes will be like, okay, is it going to actually dig down into the burials? If not, then just go ahead and cover them up. Where that's not a big issue. But this was not one of those cases. This was one of those cases where they did need to be removed, and because the firm was so respectful to the Cherokee and went to them ahead of time, the Cherokee were like the head of the Cherokee like archaeology uh, division and things like that. It was like, yeah, you can excavate them, and we'll even give you 24 hours to actually examine and document the artifacts and write down what the artifacts were, and you can draw sketches. You can't take pictures. They're usually very particular about taking pictures. They can't be put in plastic bags. It's got to be something like paper or leather or something like that. And it varies from tribe to tribe, but they're like, you could actually examine these artifacts, and even if you don't get to keep them, you'll still have the data and be able to sort of keep that. And so, which again, it often helps the tribes because, a lot of people when they hear NAGPRA, and I was guilty of this when I was younger, going through my undergrad and things like this too. A lot of people tend to think NAGPRA means you can't, examine any Native American burials at all, and that it's hampering research when it's like that's the furthest from the truth. Again, I was guilty of this. I have since been re-educated and learned. Often, most of the times, tribes will work with you. Tribes are very willing to in North America to work with archaeologists because they want to learn about their past too. Their oral histories are very detailed and very good because archaeologists are also moving away from the idea that oral history is useless because which is a whole nother conversation. But oral histories are very detailed, but they they don't all account for anything, just like written documents don't account for everything. We can go and we could always go into that in great detail too about how documents are always like oftentimes documents are like such and such went here and he passed 2 mountains and 2 rivers without giving any description of what the mountains or rivers are. So archaeology can be useful, including mortuary archaeology, for learning this. So learning about this past.
And when you look at sort of go back to European mortuary archaeologists such as Sarah Tarlow, Liv Nielsen Stutz, Melanie Giles, Duncan Sayer, people who've done really interesting work on different periods that try to tell the social and human story, the very personal story about different categories of human remains from different periods of time. And you look at the way in which, I think a lot of these debates, if people actually read this stuff and they understood the context in which many archaeologists work in commercial sectors who have these complex decisions, they would realize that we are, as a discipline, have so much mutual symbiotic relationships with local people, stakeholders, indigenous groups. There's so much. They are our greatest. Neo-pagans are some of our greatest allies, which is why I bother to put time into having conversations on social media with Norse pagans and Germanic heathens, because while there are a minority of them, as with any religious group, that are literally either just never going to listen or have got their very strong ideas, there's so much allyship, mutual. I don't know who's the ally of who, but there's so much mutual benefit in telling those stories and of connecting to those histories, that yes, there are extremists and there are dangers, but if we castigate all groups as political, as somehow dangerous or problematic, to use the popular North American parlance, everything's problematic, then what we do is we actually shutting down real potential, possibilities for dialogue with groups where there's a lot to benefit. Like if you want to conserve a Neolithic passage grave in the UK, having the fact that a few neo-pagans, Celtic pagans, use it for worship at summer solstice, how much benefit does that do? Huge. It means that someone's actually going to the site and caring about it, will report damage done, will actually be. And the same with local churches. A lot of them are the Christian congregations in this country are dying, literally dying, and the more we can get local people to care about those churches who aren't necessarily of a faith group, the better. The more we can get the local communities to engage in those historic spaces and the tombs of toffs from the 16th and 17th century within, not because we particularly love those toffs, but those aristocrats and gentry in their tombs, but the tombs tell stories about the broader community. It's a way into those broader narratives. So I think there's no easy solution, but I think when we're dealing with mortuary archaeology, whether it's 18th century crypt or it's a 5th millennium BC burial site, there's so many exciting ways we can tell the human story, and I feel that sometimes we're not always our best. Sometimes we're our worst enemies. Sometimes we're not always our best friends in realizing just how people do care. And a lot of people do respect and understand archaeology, and we don't have to keep dumbing it down. We can tell really complex stories, and people will be interested. We're gonna have a bit of faith in ourselves, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the last couple of things I wanted to discuss is on mortuary archaeology is mortuary archaeology doesn't always have to be just human based, because oftentimes there are how an type of animal, like whether it be a dog or something like that, is buried in the past, can tell us a lot about human culture as well. One of my favorite examples of this is in Mongolia. There are these, I guess you could call them megaliths. They're not necessarily megaliths in the the size of say Stonehenge or the various other like megaliths in Scandinavia, but they're still pretty tall. They're about 8 feet tall. They're called deer stones, and oftentimes buried with these deer stones, which they're called that because they have deers oftentimes carved in them. Carved on them. Oftentimes buried next to them or near them are horse burials, but these horse burials are a skull and the hooves. Just that, oftentimes, and there can be several associated with them at once. And of course, and this goes to sort of into Ian's specialty. These are oftentimes connected to the Indo-European expansions out of the Indo-European homeland, with the Afanasyevo, one of the earlier Indo-European cultures, coming into Mongolia. So it can sort of show when the attachment to the horse culture may have started to sort of disseminate into Mongolia and things like that, or whether it be the various dog burials and bear burials and things like that associated with the Northern European traditions, whether it be Celtic or Viking or things like that, because you begin to see a lot of those dog burials where there's dogs that are specifically buried, or there are dog butchering sites where people ate dog like David Anthony talks about in context with the Indo-Europeans. So I think that's something to talk about too. Well, yeah, very common. Yeah. So I think that's something important to remember too, is that mortuary archaeology doesn't just have to be humans; it can be animals as well.
Yeah.
So
because I know I did my master's dissertation on 2 sites in northeastern France, Grenay-sur-Ronde and Rivesaltes-sur-Ancre. So I mean, talking about animals, this is like humans and animals together with a material assemblage of like weapons, ceramics, and all these other things. And you do see like a lot of practices, and even like some of these are essential to our understanding of Celtic community burials and similar rites as well. And where these aren't typically seen as funerary structures, for a while they were just seen as human and animal sacrifice. Even still, it's not conclusive. There's still a possibility in certain instances, like Grenay-sur-Ronde, where it could be possible, but there's no real instance that it's one way or the other, because I'm sure, as both of you know, human sacrifice often isn't distinguishable from other things like capital punishment or certain types of funerary practices, like, for example, certain types of excarnation, specifically like defleshing. You see in one of the 3 enclosures at that are, well, technically 5 now with recent excavations at Rivesaltes-sur-Ancre. And So it's like, and even still, even though they're traditionally used as a comparison, there are even nuances between them where Reeve Monster Ankh is like the treatment of, I think it's close to 500 people who died in battle.
Yeah.
Versus Reeve Monster Ankh, a lot of the human bones are very fragmentary, and there aren't enough skeletal remains to give an estimation beyond like 25. But even still, unlike Reeve Ma, you have the presence of women there. And that was seen to be an anomaly before some archaeologists, like for example, Dirk Kraus, was like, well, this could be like a community memorial sort of thing, because you also have evidence of feasting. You have cattle, you have pig, you have a few dogs. But yeah, I mean, there's just so much of both sites that getting into it now would probably take like another 3 hours.
Yeah.
But it's just, yeah, you have animals and humans together, and there's a lot of symbolic activity going on. There's a lot of evidence of various forms of funerary practices. So it's like there's just so much going on.
Yeah.
With both the humans and animals populations of these sites.
Yeah, exactly. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think that it's an area I've addressed in my research on early Anglo-Saxon cremation burial and why are these animals sacrificed and why they're there. And it's something that it's like really funny how I contributed to a book edited by Neil Price back in 2001 on this topic. And then and I did a paper in 2005, and then no one was interested. And suddenly in Viking studies, I'm aware everyone suddenly wants to look at human animal relationships. It's wonderful. It's lovely. No, it's not. I'm not saying that I was there first, because people like Neil had already been addressing this in his doctoral research, so I was late in the game. But my point is that the animals and plants too, other non-human agents, are really important in funerary rituals past and in the traces we find. The choices of pyre material, or the choices of animals sacrificed, or maybe telling really complicated stories of relationships. And sometimes it's the animal that's being mourned as much as the person, I feel. And there's a whole series of new papers I'm aware of coming out about this very concept, and particularly the horse in Norse mythology. I've just done an Archaeodeath interview with Keith Reuter, who's a Canadian, well, he's UK based, but he's a Canadian linguist, does Old Norse law, but he's been looking at that, and various other people as well, looking at these relationships between humans and animals in the Norse literature, and then looking at the archaeology. And I know there's another forthcoming book where this topic comes up. So there's a lot of and Leszek Dewa's done a whole edited collection on animal sacrifice and human burial, and so it's a big topic, and one that I think it should be remembered. And this has knock-on effects with our public engagement, because some of the most effective, I've refused to do them. I've refused to do them on TikTok because I'm not a pet owner. I don't have that kind of sentimentality approach, but I've seen some of those powerful and popular posts by archaeologists that have been about dog memorials, dog paws in clay from the moment. People love this stuff. They literally lap it up. And I'm not deriding it. I think it's wonderful. It shows that if we're going to connect people to the human story, animals are part of that human story. Mourning animals is part of that human story. Being accompanied by animals in death is part of that story. So I think this is a wonderful aspect of how we understand past societies, but also how we engage people. And sometimes it's easier to engage people with animal death than it is to make people look their own mortality straight in the eye, so to speak. And I think there's lots of ways in which that whole theme is important. I've just done a blog post about visiting a pet cemetery and talking about the material cultures of a modern pet cemetery. And there have been papers researching this. Eric Tawney's work, looking at dog burial from the 19th century, sort of a historical archaeology of dog commemoration. And so there's some really cool stuff there. And I think it should remind us that, yes, the past was a different country, as a foreign country, but there's still lots of very similar traditions and connections to our world that people we can use to engage different types of audiences. I mean, why are we obsessed with history buffs when it's dog lovers that we can engage with? Or why are we obsessed with entertaining the First and Second World War obsessive bros, history bros, when actually it's the groups that care about when the pigeon was first domesticated, that we can get engaged in archaeology. It's just that we've got to, I think, tangentially, and there are different types of group we can capture and engage with and have constructive conversations with. I've done my research on donkey sanctuaries and memorialization in Britain, for example, and zoos. I did a research paper on modern zoos as spaces of mortuary remembrance. And, there's lots of ways we can then apply those lessons from the past onto our society. So it's a two-way process.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and you can see things like that, like for example, in how popular posts are when they're talking about the crocodiles that they found mummified in Egypt, or the monkeys,
And they should repatriate those lot as well. I feel very sorry for those cats and those ibises and wretched looking crocodiles mummified and
exactly.
I love reading about like in Northern Europe, like dogs and horses, and then and then you have various other forms of domesticates as well, depending on the region. And then also something that's been coming out, research on archaeological evidence for corvids and their associations with various cultures.
Yeah, and in China, you see dog like burials and sacrifices, and during the Bronze Age also, like independently of like the Indo-European practices, and that's connected to their beliefs during the Bronze Age too, and that's cool to read about also, and then also connected but also separate, seeing all the posts about the cats that just happen to like ruin somebody's work, like, oh, here's a cat's paw on a brick from Mohenjo-daro in India, or here's a picture of a cat's paw on this manuscript from the 1600s.
Speaking of cats ruining things, there were a few inappropriate moments where I was smiling. That's because one of my cats is very loudly snoring on my bed.
I saw one of the cats came up.
Oh yeah, I have two. Oh, sorry, two. But it's Julius is the one snoring on the bed. Augustus was the one you saw on screen.
So and that's I think something that's we can, when we're exploring mortuary archaeology, is we can talk about the human remains, but we can also talk about, like, hey, what about like I said, the horse burials, the horse head and hoof burials, and the deer stones, or the animal burials that Ian was talking about, or the relationship between the horse and Anglo-Saxons and also Scandinavians, because there was a very good master's thesis whose author I am blanking on. It's I actually did a dedicated YouTube video to this on my channel about the relationship with horses in medieval and Iron Age Scandinavian. So you can go and probably find the paper that I cited, the thesis that I cited. But but like that relationship, which is now recently started to come to people's attention, because it also sort of likens it back to the Indo-Europeans, but also the fact that there was a definite cultural exchange between, like, say, the Central Eurasian horse tribes like the Huns and such, and the Scandinavians. Like, we see that, for example, in the Birka burial that's people call a shield maiden, which I tend to think that she is one of the few exceptions because of how many weapons were in her burial, as opposed to, like, say, just an axe or a spear. But you see in her burial, you see she's got like a Central Eurasian like felt cap, and she's got a recurved bow and things like this. Like, oh, this is clearly some cultural exchange between, like, maybe the Avars or the Pechenegs or the Magyars or what have you. And we wouldn't know that if we didn't look at mortuary archaeology. So
yes, exactly.
Because and in terms of like them together, I mean, I know in the Iron Age, stuff like chariot burials are stuff that people often refer to, but going back to Rive Malser Ancre, this kind of like war or victory memorial, depending on how you interpret it. People at home, if you don't know what I'm talking about, please look it up, because it's a lot to explain. But what in one of the enclosures, there are a couple ossuaries made up of long bones and individual limbs. One's human, the other's human with some horse.
Ooh, didn't know that.
So yeah, the long bones and limbs of dozens of people and some horses that are treated in almost the exact same way. They were both excarnated and then laid deliberately in this shrine-like formation that contains ash from human bone.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, Monster Ankh is a fascinating site. Multiple theses and books have been written about it. But the same thing with Gornay sur Arons. I mean, like, there have been like what, 4 volumes written on just the excavation alone. But yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So yeah. All right. So with that, let's get to some sort of concluding concluding comments. So yeah, so my concluding comment overall, and Howard or Ian can sort of back me up upon this, is as you can see in this video, mortuary archaeology is a very nuanced subject. Excuse me. And that can be, looked at from a variety of different angles, because of course, again, I'm American and I can look at it from the American framework of laws like NAGPRA and things like that, but that doesn't always apply, as Howard talked about in depth in the video, to, for example, say England or or Austria. So it just depends on how you look at it, and it can involve a variety of different subjects like animals. And so there's that. Howard, Ian, do y'all have any concluding thoughts or anything on this?
I mean, mortuary archaeology is inherently ethical, inherently political, but it's it's such an important field for understanding the human story, but also our own mortality. And if we're moving forward with conversations about this on global platforms, whether it's YouTube or TikTok, whether it's museums that are open to the public, that in a Western society which is multicultural, multi-faith, we have to be aware that we have a profound responsibility to speak and engage with a range of different audiences beyond the usual ones that we engage with. And also we have a responsibility to the dead themselves.
Yeah.
We can't always, it's not about what they wished. I think it does become rather ridiculous when the debates get focused on, well, what would they have wanted? Well, but I do think we do have a responsibility to respectfully and as accurately as possible tell the story that we can about those remains, if we're going to bother at all. So I think it's a serious, exciting and wonderfully interdisciplinary field. And that's why I've stayed with it for so long. I've got another book coming out on this topic in relation to cremation in the early Middle Ages, which will be out late this year or early next year.
Okay.
And I while I have other interests and research angles, I've got more to come, so I'm going to stick with it. And I feel, although I'm not a museum archaeologist, I've really tried to work hard in my work to converse beyond the academy, to think about commercial, to think about CRM, as you'd call it, to think about the responsibilities we have as a discipline beyond our teaching and our academic based research, both in the field, in the museums, in terms of labs, and how we talk to the public about these topics.
Yeah. Ian, do you have any concluding thoughts? Or
I mean, I definitely agree with you in terms of, like, the what they would have wanted thing. I mean, because one thing that's always stuck with me, especially after taking a lot of these courses in funerary archaeology, among other things, is just like, a lot of times, well, most of the time, funerals are for the living. Yes, they are a means by which we honor the dead, but they're ultimately something to comfort the living, to make sure that the living accept the fact that these people have died. And so, bearing that in mind, I definitely think that, I mean, we do have a responsibility in reconstructing these stories and making sure that at least our research contributes to their understanding and conservation.
Yeah. I agree, and I think that all that comes back to, especially the whether or not we should worry about what the deceased, long deceased, would have wanted is it's again not. It's important for people who aren't archaeologists to remember it's not necessarily what the deceased would have wanted. It's like what do the and I have to harp on this. What do the countries of origin want? Because it's their say. It's the descendants of these people is what they want, and so again, taking the American framework and implying it, imposing it on China or Britain or something like that, that doesn't work because that you're not taking into account what those people want because it's their culture. As I said, the discussion for Native American burials has already been had and has already been legislated for the most part. It's not perfect and it needs to be improved upon, but that's already been had. We need to let the other countries of origin have their own discussions about their own cultures, and that's goes nicely, fits very nicely with the whether or not we should worry about what the dead would have wanted, because again, it's not what the dead would have wanted, it's what do their descendants and the quote unquote countries of origins want. So yeah, and I'm just going to leave it at that because I think that's a very nice way to leave it at. So with that, we're going to end the video. Thank you for coming on again, Howard. It's always great to have you on, and thank you, Ian, for coming on onto my YouTube channel for the first time, not coming onto one of our streams because Ian and I, along with ArchaeWolf and a couple of other archaeologists, do a archaeology themed D&D campaign where archaeologists go through the Forgotten Realms and things like that, and it's hilarious. I still have yet to upload the third episode. I need to do that probably today or tomorrow. It's been busy, but yeah. So so thank you both for coming on. If anybody has any questions about any of the subjects that we brought up in this video, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe.